Welcome to the Deconstructionist Deep Dive.
The podcast that doesn't just accept the story.
We break it
We examine the pieces.
and expose the machinery inside. Let's dive in. What if the most dangerous control system isn't the one that cages your body, but the one that convinces you it's setting you free? Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating and sometimes pretty unsettling question. How do these powerful stories, the ones dressed up in the language of freedom, actually lead us into new kinds of traps? Intellectually, maybe even spiritually. We're looking at this through the lens of some critical analyses, specifically pulling from sources like Icke's Deceptions, a heretical dismantling, and Scalpel and the Hammer, a heretical dismantling. And these aren't just dry academic papers. They're more like intellectual scalpels, really designed to cut through all the noise.
Right. And our mission here in this deep dive is pretty clear. It's not just about understanding these often complex claims about control and freedom and even what reality is. It's really about exposing the mechanics, the how of deception. How does it work? The aim is to empower you, listening, to assess information more critically, and crucially, to reveal why these ideas grab people so powerfully. What are the real implications hiding beneath the surface? We want to get past the slogans and see the actual cost of these supposed freedoms. Okay, let's start unpacking this. The first big idea our sources really dig into is the allure of absolute freedom. This often pops up as free speech absolutism, right? Defined as basically the unqualified, totally unregulated right to say anything you want with zero consequences. I mean, on the face of it, that sounds incredibly liberating, doesn't it? Just pure expression. It does sound liberating. But the analyses we're drawing on, they immediately push back on that. Hard. They argue this isn't freedom at all. They use this really provocative term. They call it infancy, or a child's definition of freedom.
Infancy? Why a child's definition?
Well, think about it. True freedom, as these sources frame it, involves understanding consequences, right? Understanding the impact your words have, the responsibilities that inherently come with any kind of power. And speech is a power, undeniably. A child wants to do whatever they want without thinking about the effects. An adult, ideally, understands that freedom and responsibility have to exist together, especially in a community.
That's a really sharp distinction, and it connects directly to some heavy philosophical hitters the sources bring in, like Friedrich Nietzsche. He wasn't just talking psychology, he was dissecting, societal values.
Exactly. The sources suggest Nietzsche would likely see this demand for consequence-free speech, not as some kind of strength or genuine striving for liberation, but as stemming from resentment.
Resentment. That's not just simple resentment, is it?
No, it's deeper. It's that kind of festering bitterness and impotent anger, often coming from a place of feeling weak or unable to act directly. So the demand for this right isn't born from authentic strength, but more from a pathetic fear, you could say, of being challenged or held accountable. It's a reaction, not a proactive assertion of true freedom.
Okay. And then you layer on Michel Foucault. His perspective really cuts through this, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The sources point out Foucault's argument that speech is not free, it is always an exercise of power. What he meant was, who gets to speak, where they get to speak, how loud their voice is amplified. That's all tied up in existing power structures. It's not some pure, neutral right floating in the ether.
Which raises a really critical question for you, the listener. When someone claims their free speech is under attack, are they actually being silenced? Or are they maybe losing access to a particular platform, losing that amplification, that power?
Right. The complaint often isn't about the ability to utter words, but about losing the megaphone, the ability to command widespread attention. It's about reach.
So, okay, bringing it back, what does this mean for you? The sources argue that buying into this notion of absolute consequence-free speech, well, it actually enslaves by convincing you that any consideration of consequence or harm is tyranny. It subtly makes you a pawn of the most malicious speakers because you feel obligated to defend their right to say harmful things, all under this banner of freedom. It twists a valuable concept.
And it's a trap, really, that many philosophies have warned about in different ways. Think about Stoicism. Freedom is internal control, right? Obsessing over the external right to say anything, regardless of impact, is missing the point. True freedom is in your mind, your responses. Buddhism warns about attachment to your own speech, aversion to others. Even anarchist thought, which deeply values free expression, still recognizes that speech has real-world consequences within a community. It demands responsibility. This absolute idea just ignores how humans actually interact.
Okay, so if absolute freedom can be this kind of subtle cage, the sources then shift to look at how false stories create these convenient external enemies. We're talking about claims like the progressive tyranny or the Ultra-Zionist Boogeyman. And what's really insidious here, the sources point out, is how these narratives often accuse opponents of the exact fascistic tactics that the person pushing the narrative is, ironically, using themselves.
Yes, and this is where it gets genuinely disturbing.
Yeah.
The sources describe this as fitting into a classic fascist rhetorical playbook.
Yeah.
A key part of that playbook is creating this monolithic enemy figure, an enemy that is somehow both ridiculously weak, maybe just a tiny group, and yet at the same time omnipotently strong. Controlling everything. Media, governments, police, the works. It's a paradox, right?
Yeah.
An enemy easy to hate because they're weak, but terrifyingly powerful, so you must fight them.
And a really crucial part of this strategy, the sources detail, is this shocking level of historical revisionism.
Yeah, they specifically call out the tactic of draining the Holocaust of its specific historical and ideological context to use its symbolic power as a cudgel against his critics.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't just getting history wrong. The sources are blunt. They call it a profound act of intellectual violence. It's weaponizing unimaginable suffering for present-day arguments.
It's profound. It reminds me of that quote from Saul Alinsky, who, the sources note, was kind of a heretic of the left. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. These narratives excel at manufacturing these huge, vague threats that just loom over you.
Exactly. The sources explicitly identified deception too. Progressives are the new Nazis as a form of historical revisionism moral equivalence. It's taking completely distinct historical situations and slapping a label on them to trivialize real atrocities or just demonize opponents. And then deception 3. A tiny network of ultra-Zionists is the primary engine of censorship that's flagged as classic scapegoat and conspiracy theory. Find a minority group, blame them for complex problems. It's an age-old tactic.
So let's apply the freedom lens here. What happens to you, the listener, if you start internalizing this stuff?
The sources are pretty damning on this. They say swallowing this kind of poison renders you historically illiterate. You lose the actual words, the concepts needed to identify real fascism when it appears, because the terms have been diluted, misused, thrown around carelessly. Your understanding of the past gets twisted, and that ultra-Zionist lie, it's described as a mental prison. It leads you down this really dark, hateful path that historically often ends in violence. It's serving up the oldest trick in the book of control. Find a minority to blame. It distracts you from looking at actual power structures by giving you an easy target. It traps your thinking.
Okay, let's shift gears again. Navigating the digital labyrinth and the simple pyramid. Now here, the sources actually acknowledge there's a powerful half-truth involved, which gives these conspiracy narratives some initial traction. Things like the documented military intelligence routes of the internet, ARPANET, for instance, and the very real issues around capitalist capture of digital platforms, surveillance capitalism. Thinkers like Shoshana Zuboff have covered this ground extensively.
Absolutely. There's a very legitimate critique to be made there about corporate power online, data harvesting, algorithmic bias, filter bubbles. All of that is real. But, and this is the crucial turn the sources highlight, this nuanced critique then gets injected with paranoid venom. Complex, often quite messy and distributed systems get personified, turned into a single shadowy cabal pulling all the strings. The problem isn't criticizing power, it's the jump to this overly simplistic, almost cartoonish villain. It actually lets you off the hook from understanding the more complicated reality.
And that leads right into the Hunger Games pyramid. The sources just call this comforting nonsense. Why comforting? Because it takes the incredibly complex, emergent, and often chaotic system of global capital and boils it down to the super simple visual. A pyramid with a, smiling, mustache-twirling 1% sitting right at the peak.
Right. And why is that simplification so appealing? And what's its real effect, according to the source?
Well, it's appealing because it gives you a clear target, doesn't it? It feels like something you can actually fight. Just knock the guy off the top. Simple.
But the sources, and they draw on thinkers like the late David Graeber here, point out that the system often isn't some brilliantly orchestrated conspiracy. It's frequently just stupid, not omnipotently clever. More like a chaotic, bumbling result of countless different actors and forces interacting, often inefficiently. And Foucault pops up again, reminding us that power isn't just concentrated at the top. It's diffused throughout the structure. It's in the code, the algorithms, the company policies, even in the actions of well-meaning moderators and the cultural norms we all absorb. That simple pyramid. It's just not equipped to map how power works today.
So the warning for you here is?
The sources warn that this Silicon Valley conspiracy lie, by painting the enemy as this all-powerful genius, actually makes you feel powerless, hopeless almost. But the messier truth that the system is often disorganized, has cracks, is full of competing interests that's potentially far more empowering. Because a messy system can be influenced, can be changed, maybe even broken in places.
And the Hunger Games pyramid lie. Through that freedom lens, the sources describe it as a map that leads to a dead end. It tells you to hate the king, not the monarchy.
Exactly. Getting rid of one CEO, one politician, one billionaire, it doesn't change the underlying system of power, ownership, and exploitation. This kind of reductionism ultimately serves the interests of the actual system by keeping your focus narrow, fixed on individuals rather than the whole structure. It keeps you busy hating figures, not dismantling the game.
All right, let's move to what might be the most subtle level of deception, the postage stamp consensus and the holographic illusion. Now, interestingly, the sources do credit the critique of institutional indoctrination as potentially valuable. You know, the idea that a mainstream education, media, even science can create a kind of limited reality tunnel, shaping what we see as normal or true. This does resonate with Foucault's ideas about power knowledge, how institutions define reality to create manageable populations.
Yes, that initial critique that our view of reality is heavily shaped by institutions, that's a valid starting point. Many critical thinkers would agree. But then, the sources say, we see the familiar pattern. He leaps off the cliff into the esoteric abyss. The proposed solution to this institutional shaping of reality isn't more critical thinking or collective action to change institutions or deeper analysis. No, it's a full retreat into what the sources call a pseudo-scientific metaphysical narcissism. The answer becomes simply, you are infinite consciousness. All problems are illusions.
And the sources label this the ultimate capitalist liberation fantasy. Instead of engaging with the messy work of changing the world, just change your perception of it. They call it mindfulness as opiate.
Yeah, and they use that Diogenes anecdote to draw a sharp contrast. Remember Diogenes the cynic, living in a barrel, rejecting conventions. His freedom was lived, material, confrontational even. It wasn't about achieving some detached, blissful state that ignores the world. It was about engaging with it on his own terms, radically. It highlights the difference between active freedom and passive detachment.
This is what the sources call spiritual bypassing, right? Using these lofty spiritual ideas to kind of sidestep confronting real-world suffering, injustice, or even your own difficult emotions.
Exactly. And it morphs into metaphysical narcissism because it turns everything inward in a very specific, unhelpful way. It tells you that systemic problems, poverty, inequality, violence aren't real issues needing collective action. They're just illusions in your personal consciousness, which conveniently absolves the actual systems of power of any responsibility. And it kills any motivation for social change. It's a narrative often pushed, consciously or not, by parts of the wellness industry and certain New Age circles who, frankly, profit from selling this detachment.
This might be the most, exquisite prison the sources describe. A cage literally made of light, as they put it. It convinces you your material conditions, your struggles for justice, they don't really matter. They're just distractions from your true infinite self. It's a philosophy that feels very convenient for those who are already comfortable.
And just technically, the sources point out the misuse of quantum physics here, what's often called quantum mysticism, is a huge category error. It's like taking a principle that applies at the subatomic level, like wave-particle duality, and wrongly applying it to, say, your bank balance or political reality. It's dressing up wishful thinking in scientific-sounding language. Nietzsche, again, would likely see this whole infinite love and detachment thing as the ultimate expression of a life-denying ascetic ideal. It rejects the difficult, messy, painful, physical reality we actually live in, favoring this kind of bland, disengaged spiritual state.
Okay, so we've pulled apart several of these narratives: absolute freedom, manufactured enemies, simplistic conspiracies, spiritual bypassing. What's the final piece? What's the ultimate deception, the rebellious synthesis the sources identify that holds this whole structure together?
The ultimate deception, according to these analyses, is the idea that the central figure propagating these views is some kind of outsider, a rebel fighting the system. The sources argue, quite forcefully, that this is the opposite of the truth. They contend he is, in fact, the perfect product and profit of the system he claims to oppose. Which system? A hyper-capitalist, individualistic, attention-based economy. He doesn't offer genuine liberation. He offers, quote, a more exciting brand of obedience. He just swaps out the old authorities like science or government for new, more esoteric ones like infinite consciousness or secret rulers. He replaces the old priests with himself.
So he doesn't actually dismantle the prison. He just redecorates it, gives you a different story about the bars, maybe sells you a key that looks cool but doesn't actually fit the lock.
That's a good way to put it. He rebrands the cage. The sources describe his whole operation as potentially representing the final stage of capitalism, the commodification of reality itself. He's selling you an alternative illusion, a more pleasing one perhaps, to distract you from the discomfort of the current one. He's framed not as a genuine revolutionary, but as a spiritual competitor in the marketplace of ideas, thriving in our attention economy. He benefits directly from the fear, the outrage, and yes, the comfort that these grand, simple conspiracies provide. It's a very well-packaged product designed to keep you mentally engaged but ultimately passive.
Wow. Okay, so after all this deconstruction, what's the takeaway for you, the listener? What's the call to action? Or maybe it's more of a call to what the sources dramatically term cognitive Armageddon.
The sources leave us with a really potent challenge. It's essentially this. Your mind is not a vessel to be filled with another's truth. Not the mainstream truth. Not the alternative truth from some self-proclaimed savior. No. It is a weapon to be sharpened on the whetstone of skepticism. The call is to metaphorically burn down these mental prisons, reject the comforting, easy answers of conspiracy, and instead embrace the messy, the terrifying, chaotic, and complex reality. The reality where there isn't one simple villain, there isn't one easy fix, and there's no salvation coming from just detaching into infinite love.
The only truth worth having, maybe, is the one you actively build yourself. The one you test against reality, and the one you live out through your own actions and your critical engagement with the actual world. That engagement, that constant questioning, maybe that's the most radical act of all.
And that's our deep dive for this week.
Remember, the most dangerous illusion is the one you don't know you're in.
But now you know. So here's our question for you. Where will you see this exact deception, the rebranding of a cage, as a key playing out in the next 24 hours?
Let us know in the comments. Question the narrative. Deconstruct the dogma. See the system.
We'll see you next time. Stay skeptical.
Thank you for joining us.